Hello, everyone. I'm Walker Bragman, and I'm here with Jessica Scarane, who is running against Chris Coons for a Delaware Senate seat. Ms. Scarane, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So, how are you holding up in this quarantine?
I think okay. I'm glad to have the campaign to focus on. I know that I am in a really lucky position where, I'm actually still working full time at my day job, which complicates campaigning, of course, but I'm really grateful that I have a job that I can, transfer to working from home pretty easily, pretty seamlessly. And, I haven't lost that job, and same thing goes for my husband. So I know that our family, our immediate family is doing really well. I am glad, I've been really happy that the campaign has existed during this time, because we were able to take our campaign volunteers and the infrastructure that we had in place and turn our phone banking operation into an outreach and a resource providing operation as well. So I think that I'm really grateful for the fact that we had that structure in place, because what we've been able to do in response to this is take those voter file lists that we were going to call to share campaign information and make sure that we're doing check-ins on people and reach out to people who might need help. And we have found a whole lot of people who are struggling and need help right now. And we've had volunteers who are doing resource runs for people, who are going to food banks for people and picking up food and then delivering it to their houses. A lot of the food banks, in an effort to keep social distancing and make sure that people aren't coming into contact with each other, have required cars. But a lot of our voters don't have a car to go and pick up. So we've been able to put volunteers in place to help them out with that. We've helped people figure out what's going on with their unemployment insurance and to actually get their unemployment. So I've just been happy that we've been able to help people out through this, and that it's given me something to put energy into and feel like we are working towards something and making things better. Because what I hear a lot from people, what I believe as well, is that if we had a lot of the things that we are fighting for, like Medicare for all and a stronger social safety net, and all of these things that would come if we had a government that was focused on taking care of people are recognizing that if we had those things, we'd be in a much better place right now. So I think it's really driven a lot of people to stand up and fight for change as well.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I wanted to ask you about what you think the biggest lessons are from this whole crisis. It sounds like you have some idea.
Yeah, no, I think that is one of them. It's that we have a government that is not fulfilling its duty of taking care of its citizens right now, and its people and its country. And people feel left behind because of that. People die because of that, because they can't get healthcare, because they go without food. Like, these are all problems that have existed well before this virus showed up. And what coronavirus has done is it's acted as an accelerant, and it's made all of these problems come to bear even more evidently to a lot of people. But it hasn't necessarily changed the fact that these problems already existed. It's more that it's exposed them to more people. And I think that a lesson is that we have to keep fighting for the things that are going to prevent us from getting in this place again. Like, we are one of the only countries that now has something like a quarter of our working population on unemployment as a result of this. And that is because of the response that we got from our government. We got a response that at first was catered towards corporations who were able to take advantage of trillions of dollars of money from the Fed, when regular people, some regular people, not all regular people, got a $1,200 check. And that is not enough to hold people over. It is not enough to actually keep our economy from tanking. And what I hope people have been able to recognize is that a lot of the problems that people in our country face are all interconnected. This started as a public health crisis. And because we didn't do a good job of keeping people attached to their jobs and keeping them on salary, then it turned into an economic crisis. And because we didn't get any sort of response as to actually canceling rent or mortgage payments, it's likely to now turn into a housing crisis, because people are going to be in a place where if they've missed rent, in the state of Delaware, you have 30 days before your landlord can bring eviction proceedings against you. So if you've missed rent now for 2-3 months, how are you going to catch up in 30 days? So now we're going to have a housing crisis looming. So all of these things are cascading problems. And until we recognize that, like, we have to take care of people and take care of all these problems and create a stronger foundation, like, we're not going to be poised to handle a crisis like this again.
So you're running in a state like Delaware, which is, I mean, Delaware is famous for its favorable corporate laws. Home to something like 60%, I think, of the Fortune 500 companies, the world's Fortune 500 companies. And there was another progressive candidate who ran in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, Carrie Evelyn Harris, and she did not unseat Tom Carpenter in 2018. And you're running on a similar platform. Do you think that this crisis has made the case easier for you?
In ways, yeah. And I think that Carrie running and Bernie running in 2015 and 2016 before her, that has really helped build a foundation for the conversations that we're having now in 2020. When we went to people's doors, when we could still go to doors, when we call them now, if myself or a volunteer says the phrase Medicare for all to them, they're not asking what that is. They're not asking to be, we're not at a place where we have to explain it. If we say single payer healthcare, people know what that is. And I think what we have seen is that we have been able to build on this more progressive push, this more leftist push in the state of Delaware, because we are actually talking to the material conditions of people's lives that they can recognize, like, this should not be this way. I should not have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to get by. So the focus of, our campaign is really to make sure that we are addressing the things that matter in people's lives. So I will say that the work that was done before us by, Carrie's campaign in particular, though you're right, she did not win. She did get 35% of the vote. That's 15 points from, half the vote. Like, that's pretty good for a state that really hasn't had a lot of progressive challenges before, has not had a lot of primaries at all before. So we think that there's energy for this year, and it comes out in the conversations we have with voters. I think that does intersect with coronavirus as well. There are multiple conversations I've had where people have said, I wasn't in on Medicare for all. I wasn't totally sure about this idea, but tell me more about it. It's opened up people's willingness to have that conversation. If someone's lost their job and lost their health insurance with it in the middle of a public health crisis, that's going to affect the way that they think about our current insurance system. It's going to affect the way that they think about what their lives are going to be like going forward. And I think that has been the biggest conversation that we've seen change. That and then just things like job security and wages and the stability that people have in their lives, and people recognizing that even when you have a good job, things can be unstable.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are pretty staggering. Like 40 million now have filed for unemployment. The numbers are comparable for people who've lost their insurance. I mean, it really does seem like if we had this infrastructure in place, we would be in a much better position now. And part of the problem, I think, is people in DC who have focused on budgetary constraints when it comes to things like the safety net. In fact, your opponent is somebody who he's known as like the GOP's favorite Democrat, I believe is
Yes.
what he's been called in the past, talking about how all options need to be on the table, including cuts to Social Security. That's not something you would ever support, is it?
No, and I want to talk about that because Senator Coons came into office in 2010. And we were coming out of the last major recession that our country has faced. And that's when he was talking about having all possibilities on the table to cut to make sure that we got the deficit under control. So that was a quote that he said from the day one that he's been elected. And we are now about to face the same situation. And what is happening? He is again making comments about how there's concern about the deficit and there's concern about the looming debt. And what that always means, that's a signal to tell us that cuts are coming, that we're going to be told to tighten our belts. And the last thing we should be doing is coming for working people. Like, get rid of the tax cuts to the wealthiest people in our country and corporations before you ever come for us. Raise taxes on the wealthiest people in our country before you ever come for us. I am 35 years old. It was only, a few years before my life when the top tax rate was 70%. Like, these things are not unfathomable, but we have people who are catering to a donor class that keeps them in office, that are catering to corporate interests that keep them in office, rather than looking out for the people who actually voted them into office. And when I hear things like all options have to be on the table, or we should be worried about the deficit, I've been talking to people about how you have to be fearful of that, because that means they're going to come after the things that you rely on as a person in this country, rather than saying, how do we actually ensure that the wealthiest people and corporations in our country are actually paying their fair share?
So how do you translate these sorts of messages to people in their everyday lives? I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about people are now starting to see like Medicare for all may be a better option than having their insurance tied to their employment. But when it comes to something like the environment, how do you, or rising sea levels, how do you relate that to Delaware voters?
Yeah, well, that one in particular is incredibly important to Delawareans. So we are the lowest lying state in the country. And I don't think a lot of people recognize that, but we are already seeing the effects of things like rising sea levels. So there's neighborhoods in the city of Wilmington that flood every single time it rains, storms, they're underwater. Downstate, we have instances where even when there's not a storm, the tides are coming in so high that they're overrunning roads. We are losing beach property and need to constantly be replacing and rebuilding beaches. We are seeing things like salinization of farmland in the water table. So our state has quite a few farmers. They're losing acres and acres of their land, and it's becoming unfarmable because of the influx of salt water into the water table. So these are things that are happening literally right now. And you combine that with the fact that our state is also a particularly polluted state. We have a history of chemical companies in this state that have dumped waste onto our land and into our water, and that is still a problem. We have communities in our state that don't have drinkable water from things like forever chemicals, as well as things like, it sounds kind of obscure, but runoff from chicken processing plants.
I was going to say, you have a lot of chicken processing in Delaware.
Yeah, it's a huge thing here. And again, it doesn't get addressed because these are the people who fund our politicians and give them money and give them donations and ask for favors in return. And these are things that affect people's daily lives. So I think to get back to your question really specifically is like, our conversations are all very much about what's important to you. Let's start there and talk about what's going on in their lives. And we talk about the way that our platform intersects with the problem that they're facing. It's not necessarily running at them with the full platform and saying, this is what I believe in, don't you believe in this as well? It's really more about, what do you believe in? And where are the things that I believe in? Where are they intersecting? And let's have a conversation about that, because that's what actually makes it real for people. And that's what actually relates it to their daily lives, because we're not just talking about, platitudes or a feeling. We're really talking about the things that people want to see someone fighting for and fight for themselves.
So I think I have an idea, but how do you feel about the Democratic response? I mean, obviously the president's response to the crisis that we're facing now has been a disaster, I think on multiple levels. And you're running as a Democrat for the Senate. So even if you didn't agree, you're probably going to agree in an interview, but you obviously agree. But I wanted to ask about the Democratic response. You don't think they're doing enough?
No, I don't think so. I think that, obviously the president's response is abysmal. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, who frankly Chris Coons lobbied for and encouraged other Democrats to confirm, his response has also been abysmal. He's a drug company executive, not a public health expert. So all of the people that we should be able to trust to respond to this have not been capable of doing it. And I don't think that I have seen people centered enough in the bills that have come out of Congress. When we're talking about, Senator Coons referred to the $1,200 that people got as a remarkable payment. And he actually gave Donald Trump credit for it, for advancing the idea that we should do direct payments to individuals. I don't know a single person that felt like that was remarkable. It hit their bank account, and the most people told me is like, I paid off some credit card debt. If they were in an okay place, they were like, I'm going to stock it away because I don't know what might be coming. Most people did not feel saved by that payment. So this disconnect with how people are living and what they actually need seems to come through no matter, frankly, what party people are associated with. And there are examples of I think bills that were, or at least proposals that would have been more effective. I talk about the Rashida Tlaib's bill to mint the coin bill that we talked about quite a bit, in March and April. I thought that would have been a really good bill to enact. And part of the reason that I really like that bill is not only because it was going to give direct monthly payments to individuals in our country for the duration of this crisis and months afterwards, it also set up infrastructure that does not exist for people right now. And what I mean by that is, how many people qualified for that $1,200 but still couldn't get it, or the IRS had an old bank account for them, or they had filed jointly with their mother a year ago and the money went to her bank account instead of their bank account, and it just, no one actually got their payments that easily. And instead, Rashida Tlaib is saying, we're going to give everyone a card so that there's actually the infrastructure in place for us to make direct payments from the government to the people. This is something that exists for corporations. When Congress tells the Fed to change the numbers in the spreadsheet, they do that, and then there's structure to lend out to corporations. This doesn't exist for people, and I think that's the type of change that bill in particular I really liked, because it created this structure that we lack right now.
So what do you think about these calls to reopen? I mean, obviously, here in New York, Governor Cuomo just tweeted that.
Sure.
Right.
This is how we do things now.
It always feels weird. I mean, Twitter, it has become very central to our national discourse. But yeah, so anyway, he tweets that we're reopening, we're on track to reopen on June 8th. I'm sitting here like, I'm in Brooklyn, and I'm like, we don't have a vaccine, we don't have an effective treatment, and we don't have herd immunity. So I don't really understand these the push to reopen. I mean, I guess I do. It's summer. People want to get outside. It's an election year, so neither party wants to really go out on a limb. And Trump wants to get back to normal. Democrats are too afraid to back like the aid that people would need to shelter in place safely. But what do you think of the push to reopen? Do you think it's premature, and how would you go about it as a senator?
I think I agree with a lot of the points you're making, is that, we never got the level of testing infrastructure into place that we were told we needed. The CDC put out guidelines that were actually lower guidelines than originally proposed for reopening. And I believe something like 2 of the states are even meeting those guidelines right now for reopening, but so many are reopening. And it sort of just feels like we're hoping the problem goes away rather than actually addressing it. And, we had some of those reopen the economy protests happening here in our state capital and downstate. And they're frustrating because they're calling for workers to go back to work and potentially endanger themselves for a lot of people's comfort and a lot of people's this drive for normalcy. And I really believe that had we done a better job of protecting people's salaries and protecting the incomes of small businesses and making sure that people didn't feel like their lives were falling apart, we'd probably be able to have a bit of a better conversation about this. When we have beaches reopening because of Memorial Day, there was this call to reopen the beaches in our state ahead of Memorial Day, and it did not feel like it was based on public health. It felt like it was based on revenue and wanting to make sure that people could get to the beach. I don't think it's ever been communicated, what are the guidelines that people are supposed to be meeting and how are we tracking towards them? We hear a lot in our state of just things are looking good, things are going down, But that's not to say once you reopen everything, they won't immediately go back up.
Right. It's like just because you're not getting wet doesn't mean you don't need an umbrella.
Exactly. So it's more like things are working and what we're doing is working. I don't really see how we're actually, I haven't seen yet how reopening is going to prevent things from getting worse very quickly. So that's kind of where I sit. I think what's upsetting about this the most is that people were sort of sold this idea that it's either the economy is closed or it's not. And it did not have to be this sort of either or zero sum game. We could have taken care of people's health and taken care of people's salaries and their livelihood without having to pit those two things against each other. And I'm particularly concerned about workers who are going to feel pressured to go back to their jobs, who, if they don't, would get kicked off of unemployment. So they're going to be having to make that choice for themselves without anyone looking out for them to say, am I putting my health in jeopardy or am I putting my paycheck in jeopardy? And I don't think that's a choice that we had to force people to make.
Yeah, it really is kind of stunning when you put it that way.
Yeah,
it's disappointing here. Like, so we live in Brooklyn. My fiance works in Manhattan, and to get to her job, which is talking about reopening, she'd have to take the subway, and it's just it really doesn't feel like worker safety is being prioritized, or more than that, it feels like there's just not the political will in DC to provide for people or to give the aid that is necessary. I mean, you mentioned Talib's bill, and that is a beacon, I guess, like a one example of a politician who is proposing sort of what people would need, and it just doesn't seem like there's enough support. Would you support Schumer for minority leader again, or majority leader if Democrats take the Senate?
I think that I would really need to understand what we would be fighting for and see that commitment, because I think that's really what it comes down to for me. Like, I don't make decisions on who to vote for or who to support based on who they are, or frankly, even like the experience they have. It's really more about like, what are we fighting for? And I think I would need to see like alignment with what we're fighting for.
So every state has quirks, and I'm starting to try to ask this to the candidates that I talk to, because I've been to all but 5 states, and every single state has something unique and interesting about it and is worth visiting. So what's the most Delaware thing about you?
About me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I know. Serious stuff, and then a question.
I know, man. All right. What is the most Delaware thing about me?
Like, how has Delaware affected?
Well, I think that there's a hot dog place here called Cheerhead that I really like. That's kind of become a weird thing that I didn't have before, that I really adopted since living here. No, that's a really great question. I think that Delaware is particularly interesting because though it's small, there's so many different like types of places to live. We span from like urban areas in the more northern part of the state all the way down to like beaches and farmland, like I talked about. So you get these like different cultures like across this whole area of the state that has less than 1 million people in it. So it's like it's really, that is almost like the quirk of it is, like we're talking about a state that's the size of some people's congressional districts, and yet there's so much sort of diversity of like just landscapes and activities and things and cultures, that I think that's like one of the things I really enjoy about it, is because you can be in the city at the beginning of the day and at the beach, in an hour and a half, and everything in between. And there's like a real, whatever the state word for patriotic feeling about that.
We'll go with that. Statriotic. I like that. Um, and so, okay, so then my last question, is I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I do appreciate you
Yeah.
taking time out of campaigning. I mean, running a Senate campaign is not easy.
No.
It's hard enough to run for a congressional district, but like a statewide race, as you said, there are a ton of cultures
Yeah.
in Delaware. So I grew up in an area where there was very sharp divide between people with a ton of money
Mhm.
and people with not so much money, or people who make maybe they make more than what the national average, like where people would be considered like very middle class nationally, but in the area it equates. Um, and that definitely affected my politics. It changed the way that it affected the way that I look at the world. Um, so how has Delaware shaped your politics?
Yeah. I think that that is a particularly similar journey. So I live in the city of Wilmington, and the city of Wilmington has incredible wealth disparity. You know, we're talking about a city that has incredibly impoverished and under-resourced neighborhoods that are less than a mile from the places where some of the wealthiest people in our state live. And there's there are these feelings of these sort of like faux barrier lines that exist between those neighborhoods or those places, lines that are maybe just a street that's 4 lanes wide instead of 2 lanes wide, and it becomes this point of barrier. And I think that that experience and living sort of kind of crossing between those things as I go to work every day or go to get lunch and go and live my life, it it caused, it's not that I wasn't aware of these things beforehand, obviously, but it certainly made me realize that we could be doing so much more to guarantee a foundation and a dignified standard of living to every single person in this country. And that is what I believe the promise and the goal and the function of our government should be. And I don't see it right now. And there are differences and policies that I support and myself and a lot of other progressive candidates support that I know would make a difference on day one in the lives of a lot of people in our state. And when I have people telling me that they have to, work, I knocked a door last winter, and a teen answered the door, and he was like, still wanted to talk and like know why I was out here. And one of the things I asked him, like I said, I always ask people what's important to them, what do they care about? And the thing that he said was that I worry about my family staying together. And I kind of didn't really know exactly what he meant, so I asked him to expand on it. And what he meant was that he, as a teen, his mother and his father all work multiple jobs. They all end up working like 6-7 days a week. And his concern is that they have to work so much and fight so hard to survive that they don't even get to spend time with each other. And this is the place that we have pushed people to, where everyone is working so many hours for so little wages just to keep their heads above water. And it does not have to be that way. And that, I think, is the thing that started to shift here in my views here, is that I really moved away from this idea that like we have to make these small steps and we have to move, like pull a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time. Like, I don't think that's ever going to get it done for the people who are living so close to the line right now. And particularly when we have a conservative and right wing of our country that isn't moving step by step, are actively trying to take massive steps and undo a lot of the protections that people have right now. This idea of incremental and a little bit at a time is not going to cut it anymore. And we have to be bolder than that, and we have to think bigger than that, and to actually fight for the things that will make people's lives better.
That was a hell of an answer. Thank you again for taking the time and speaking with me. I tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah.
And when the primary vote is.
Yes. So I am running in the Democratic primary in the state of Delaware, which happens on September 15th this year. You can learn more about me at jessfordelaware.com. You can also sign up to volunteer. We love phone bankers right now. We are phone banking basically 9 hours a day from noon to 9 every day. People are phone banking, reaching out to voters. Like, we are a very field driven campaign. And until we can get back out on the doors, that's what we're doing. So you can sign up to volunteer at justfordelaware.com/volunteer, or always a donation is welcome. Right now, we are doing a fundraising push to actually put our name on the ballot. In the state of Delaware, you pay to get on the ballot, you don't petition. So we are raising the $10,440 that it costs to get on the ballot. And then we're going to go and do that on the first week of June, which I'm very excited to do. But yeah, that's a nice little wrinkle that people don't recognize. So a donation is always welcome at justfordelaware.com/donate.
And thanks again. And everybody, check it out.
Yeah. Thank you.